I'm walking through some of my favourite landscapes in Shropshire, and this is just so archetypically rural England. It's right out of Thomas Hardy and whatnot. Beautiful big cornfields, lovely soft light. You don't really get the harsh extremes of Spain over here. And of course it's not boiling hot, so there's no danger of me getting sunstroke. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris Wright. I'm standing in the middle of a cornfield in Shropshire, and that might come as a bit of a surprise because I'm normally standing in the middle of a mountain in Spain, but I'm over in the UK having a bit of a holiday on my way to Scotland for a week of photographing in the Highlands and down by the sea in Scotland. So that's going to be coming out in about a week's time. But for the moment, I'm in Shropshire and I'll be here until a little while. So what I wanted to do was to carry out some experiments, really. One of the things that I've done a video about recently was Ansel Adams, and I had quite a few people contact me after that video to say that it's all very well talking about the way that DxO software maps onto it, but that's really missing the point of the entire Ansel Adams experience. And I'm not 100% in agreement with that perspective, but I do. I certainly listen to what people tell me, and so I've had a really good look at what Ansel Adams had to say about shooting. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was that it became apparent, and I've literally read 4 or 5 books on this subject, and I'll put a list of them down below. So if anyone's enthusiastic enough, they can get hold of them. But the key part was mapping Ansel Adams Zone System onto digital photography. Now, if you don't already know, what the crux of the Ansel Adams system was exposing really for the darks, because he did not want to lose information into the shadows. Now, in digital photography, there's 2 things that go on. One is that if we overexpose the lights, you'll never get it back. White is white, and there is nothing beyond white. However, black is a different kettle of fish. We can expose much more readily, or we can bring detail back from the blacks. And I think as a landscape photographer, I've become somewhat blasé about this, and so my philosophy has always been that the camera is essentially a data gathering tool, and that getting it right in camera is not absolutely essential. But what I have noticed is some lack of consistency in the pictures that I bring into the editing phase, and where that manifests typically is if a photograph is badly underexposed, or if it contains a lot of shadow. Noise is not a problem, because we've got software now that is really good at removing noise. But what I have found as a problem is a slight I describe it as a sort of plasticity that attaches to some of the objects that come out of the shadows. So particularly rocks and things like that look slightly unrealistic. And I suspect that the reason for that is not just the photographer's incompetence, and I absolutely hold my hand up to that, but it is to do with the amount of the way that the sensor handles shadow. So I've had perfectly good compositions that I've had to chuck out because they don't look realistic enough. Now, the antidote to this is obviously to expose to the right, and one of the things that appeals about the Ansel Adams system is that it did offer consistency in exposures. So we're looking at a colour scene But if we think of it, if we think of the tonal characteristics of the scene and try to fit that into the zone system, in other words, if we try to translate this in our heads into black and white, what I have seen suggested is that if you meter on zone 7 and expose a couple of stops above zone 7, you will automatically find yourself exposing to the right, but protecting the highlights, because zone 7, 2 stops above zone 7 is zone 9. It's at zone 10 that white becomes white. So that that seems to me to be a reasonably sensible way to go about things. However, I've tested this out in the wild, and of course it doesn't work. It overexposes, because where you have a photograph that, say, contains a bright sky, then that equally will be exposed 2 stops over. So this doesn't work at all well. What I have found does work well, though, is a system that I've sort of evolved. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done this, but I've evolved this system over time, of metering on the spot that I want to be very sure is accurately represented in the photograph. In other words, the important thing. It's not necessarily the subject of the photograph. And that works really well, I find, although I have to keep an eye on the highlights. So it is basically exposing to the right. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make 3 exposures of this picture. And I'm going to expose bang on the middle. I'm going to expose -1, and I'm going to expose on +1. And we're going to take a look at those shots in the studio and see which one of them gives us the best exposure in terms of what is the most malleable in Photoshop or PhotoLab or whatever you happen to be using. It'll be exactly the same with all 3 of them, including whatever you happen to be using, but Affinity Photo, Photoshop or PhotoLab. So that's the object of this. But of course, the main object, as ever, is to get a decent photograph. So I'm going to get on with that. So let's just have a look at the scene. So this is the scene, and this is obviously on my DJI Osmo. So what we're seeing here, we've got the arc of a farm track going up towards the woods, curving round where it starts to point at that tree on the horizon. And to make this even nicer and potentially quite a special picture, we've got the arc of where the combine harvest has been mowing, which mirrors the arc of the lane, and it's just below the tree, so it pulls us back around into the tree, and I think that's quite good. So let's have a look at that and see what we can get out of it. Initially the near area, followed by the near middle, followed by the sort of half distance, followed by the distance. Okay, and these will be overlapping areas of focus. So the intention is to merge all of these together and get perfect focus front to back. Now, I did this for a normal exposure and for one under normal as indicated by the camera's metering. And the way that I do this is a little shortcut here. If you take a photograph of your hand between the sets, yes, it's a total waste of a frame, but in Lightroom or any other processing environment, you're going to be able to see the borders between the sets of photographs. So if we take the darker exposures, it's this one, and that one. Yep, and there's the other hand. And we do edit in, and we go to open as layers in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. It's loading the layers. Give it a second. Okay. Now, even though this was done on a tripod, it's possible that there was what we call focus breathing between the shots, which is a small shift as you adjust the focus. So what we need to do is to adjust the layers. So we'll go highlight all 4 pictures, go to edit, and go to auto align layers. And we choose auto. There's no reason not to. Be a very small difference in these shots. Okay, and if you look in the at the base of this, you'll see that there has indeed been a very, very small shift. You've got some empty pixels at the bottom of the stack. Okay, so having aligned it, we now go to edit again, and we go to auto blend layers. And what this will do is create automatically masks that will give you the best focus areas in the shot. And generally Photoshop is pretty good at this. And you'll see the masks generated in a second. Foreground, middle, far middle, distant middle. Okay, so that's now blended. We can save this as a TIFF, which will automatically convert it as a TIFF, and it will send it straight back to Lightroom. Now this is a very convenient workflow, and we can pretty much match it, but without some of the convenience. But if we were to take these pictures out of DxO and export them to Affinity, Affinity will do this focus blending just as well. And then we'd have to re-import the resultant photograph back into PhotoLab to do editing on. Okay, so just to that export has gone through, and here is the export. Crop it, go with 4:5, take that up to there, and now you've got perfect pin sharp focus front to back of the picture. Okay. So I wanted to look a little bit deeper into what Ansel Adams was doing. And there are some things that are clearly understood, and there are other things that are not clearly understood, not least by me. And I think, to summarize it, I think that there's a number of things in play. With the zone system, what the photographers would do, film photographers, is to expose for the darks. And that is because of the way that film processing works. Now, in digital photography, we don't do that, because if we expose for the darks, we blow out the skies. And in digital photography, you cannot retrieve anything from pure white. You can't retrieve much from pure black either, but there are a lot more grades of black than there are grades of white, if you get my drift. There are detail that you can pull out of the shadows where there is no real equivalent in the sky. Okay, so we have to expose to the right as digital photographers, but it struck me that Ansel Adams' method is a lot more useful to digital photographers than we might at first think. Now, what I mean by that is that because he was talking about tonal values, not colours, he was effectively abstracting away from colour, away from what you see, and he came up with a system that described it in such a way that exposure of any scene, as long as it was exposed using the methodology to determine what the exposure actually should be, would be consistent and repeatable and ultimately printable in every case. That struck me that there's something we can take away from that. There's something we can learn from that. And although we do a lot more fiddling about, if you like, with the camera to determine our exposures, whereas a lot of that fiddling about is done in the darkroom in film, there is still something we can learn, because what we know is, with a histogram that is effectively bell-shaped, that sits roughly in the middle, you're going to have a great deal more latitude to pull realistic colour and realistic detail out of the shadows and out of the lights. With a histogram that's pushed up against the dark end, you run the risk of not just noise, but I've found there's a sort of a plasticity to some of the darker elements that I might try to pull out. And that doesn't work at all. And I've lost some perfectly good compositions by ineptly underexposing them. Now, in digital, the answer to this is, if we can't get a perfect sort of bell curve, then we do multiple exposures and we blend them together. So we'll typically bracket the exposure, go one under, one perfectly exposed according to the metering, another one over. And that gets us out of trouble. That seems to work, but it seems to me that I can still learn quite a lot from the Ansel Adams way of doing things. So a lot of what this is about pushing the limits of my digital setup to find out what is and what is not possible. Yeah, so grappling with the zone system is far from straightforward, and the biggest impediment, of course, is that you're looking at a colour scene and trying to map tonal equivalence onto it. Now, one of the things that I've seen suggested is that the photographer meters on zone 7. So zone 7 is defined as basically, or the exemplar for zone 7 is snow with shadows. So effectively grey snow. So it's quite a light value. And there are 3 zones above it. So if one were to meter for zone 7 and increase the exposure by a couple of stops, you'd be metering on probably the brightest thing in the photograph in most cases. Obviously you exclude things like the sun from that, but so you'd be exposing to the right. Now, what I'd like to do is a sort of slightly more scientific experiment to see how, see if this bears up, this theory. But if it does, it would give us a way, perhaps a slightly more reliable way than simply, as I have done in this video, exposing in the middle and then increasing the exposure or decreasing the exposure depending on the light. So I think there's probably another video to come on this where we try to get a more repeatable method of applying the zone system in the field with a digital camera. Okay, so if you've stuck this far, thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, or if it's been useful to you, give it a tick down below. And subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. So we're going to Scotland next week, and I'm hoping that the video next week will be shot in Scotland on the beach. All right, so see you next week, guys. Thanks a lot. Bye now.